The air in the sanguine citadel was not merely cold, it was the chill of ancient, unforgiving judgment. It carried the metallic scent of iron and the faint, sweet tang of spilled blood, clinging to the velvet banners and the towering Gothic arches. A single agonizing sound sliced through the oppressive silence, the guttural, seismic roar of the vampire queen. "My daughter is pregnant and her husband is a human?" Queen Lyra's voice was the sound of mountains splitting apart, amplified by the high stone vaulting of the judgment hall. She sat upon the obsidian throne, a figure of terrifying, armored magnificence. Her massive, scaled wings, blood-red at the edges, were flared wide, catching the thin shafts of moonlight filtering through the cathedral's stained-glass windows, turning her silhouette into that of a vengeful deity. Crimson energy flickered around her gauntlet hands, casting infernal shadows on the faces below. Facing her, trembling but defiant, stood Seraphina, her daughter and Lyra's heir. Seraphina's own smaller, nascent wings, still soft, the color of ash and night, shivered with her labored breaths. Her ivory-white hair was wild around her shoulders, stark against the deep purple gown that strained over her pronounced abdomen. She was a picture of nobility and terror, her large, ruby eyes fixed on the rage of her mother, the woman who commanded the entire kingdom of Viridia. Clutching Seraphina's arm, standing slightly behind her as if his insignificant presence could somehow protect her, was Ethan. He was the anomaly, the intruder, the source of this seismic fury. He was flesh and blood, warm and weak, dressed in the simple rough-spun clothes of the valley dwellers, a human. The sheer, overwhelming power emanating from Lyra pressed down on him like a physical weight, stealing the air from his lungs. His own terror was a raw, exposed thing, visible in the frantic dart of his eyes and the sheen of cold sweat on his forehead. "Mother, please," Seraphina whispered, her voice cracking, a tiny sound swallowed by the cavernous hall. "He is my husband. And this child is ours. He is not disposable." Lyra didn't look at Ethan. She looked only at her daughter, and the expression of profound disappointment was sharper than any blade. "Ethan. A name fit for a footnote. Disposable? Seraphina, he is dust. He is a moment of carelessness. He is the transgression of the first edict, the very law that defines us, that protects the purity of our line." Lyra gestured sharply, the movement shattering one of the nearby torch sconces into a fountain of sparks. "The purity edict states that the blood of the Viridian line shall never be mingled with that of the short-lived, the weak, the mortal. This thing growing inside you is an abomination. It is a biological treason against this throne." Ethan finally managed to speak, a desperate croak. "Your Majesty, I love Sarah. I would never harm her or your people. We just want to live." Lyra let out a sharp, derisive laugh that held no humor, only malice. "What? Humans exist to feed the ground, boy, or perhaps, on a good night, to feed us. You do not exist to rule, to mate, or to pollute my dynasty. You were warned away from the borders. You knew the law." Seraphina squeezed Ethan's hand, a silent signal for him to stop talking. The sheer scale of the situation, the 1,000-year-old tradition, the throne built on fear and blood, the life of the entire vampire kingdom, was crushing them. They had known this day might come, but the reality was far more terrifying than the clandestine whispers they had shared under the moonlit canopy of the lower valleys. 6 months ago they had met by accident, near the desolate border known as the Scar. Seraphina, burdened by the endless expectations of the throne, the tedious lessons in ancient cruelty, and the rigid politics of the court, had sought a moment of genuine solitude. She had disguised herself in a cloak and ventured into the mist-shrouded wilderness that separated the vampire territories from the scattered human settlements. Ethan, a cartographer and botanist driven by a reckless curiosity and a desperate need to find rare medicinal herbs, was exactly where he should not have been. He was tracing a forgotten creek when he found her. She was not in her armor or her court silks. She was sitting on a damp stone, staring up at the alien twin moons of Viridia, looking utterly lost. He hadn't recognized her at first. He had only seen the incredible, heartbreaking beauty and the strange, haunting sadness in her eyes. When she turned and he saw the faint, crimson sheen of her irises, recognition, and paralyzing fear, had hit him like a physical blow. But instead of running, he had frozen. "You shouldn't be here," she had said, her voice soft, entirely unlike the commanding tones she was trained to use. "Neither should you, by the look of your clothes," Ethan had managed, his fear tempered by the sudden, inexplicable urge to protect this fragile creature. It was a stupid human instinct. Over the next few weeks they exchanged stolen hours, meeting in that neutral, forgotten zone. Ethan shared his simple, mortal world, the smell of earth after rain, the sound of human laughter, the sheer joy of a sunlit morning. Seraphina shared the cold weight of her destiny, the loneliness of power, the blood-soaked future that awaited her. She never drank from him. She simply basked in his warmth, finding in his fleeting, fragile humanity a reprieve from her eternal, cold life. Their love wasn't a sudden Hollywood explosion. It was the slow, inevitable creep of two lonely souls reaching across an impossible chasm. Ethan loved her power, her fierce intelligence, and her hidden vulnerability. Serafina loved his light, his ability to see beauty in the mundane, and the way his mortal heart beat so rapidly and honestly beneath her touch. The moment everything irrevocably changed was 3 months ago, in a hidden cavern they called the Sanctuary. It was a single reckless night where the weight of their species and their futures vanished entirely. They knew the risk, but the fear of never truly connecting was far greater than the fear of Lyra's wrath. Now, standing before the throne, the consequences were terrifyingly real. Serafina felt the child move inside her. A sudden, fierce kick, a silent assertion of its half-life, half-death existence. The movement distracted her and Lyra saw it. Lyra leaned forward, her red eyes narrowing to fiery slits. The child is accelerating its growth. The blood is confused. It will be a monster, Serafina. It will have the short fuse of the human and the endless power of the immortal. Anarchy born in the sacred womb of Viridia. It is my child. It has your blood, mother. Serafina cried out, tears finally streaming down her face, glittering like diamonds in the gloom. You talk of purity but you fear change. You fear anything you cannot control. Lyra's mask of cruel calm finally snapped. She rose slowly from the throne, the obsidian grinding beneath her gauntlets, her tremendous wings casting the chamber into deeper shadow. The air grew thick, electric. Control? I am control, Serafina. I am the reason this kingdom stands. You, my heir, have shown weakness. You have poisoned the future of our entire race for a temporary sensation with a creature worth less than the dust under my heel. She descended the dais in a single, terrifying glide, stopping barely 3 feet from Ethan. He couldn't move, his body had utterly betrayed him, paralyzed by primal fear. Lyra lowered her voice, though it still resonated with deadly power. You have been found guilty of the highest treason, boy. You have illegally mingled your bloodline with the royal coven, and you have, by proxy, threatened the stability of the Viridian throne. Your existence is no longer tolerable. Lyra did not look at her daughter. She looked instead at the 2 massive black-clad royal guards stationed at the edges of the hall. Vardis, kill him. Take the human. The sentence for high treason by an external entity is simple, immediate and total annihilation. Make an example of his body. Leave nothing but ash. The 2 guards, figures of imposing height and lethal skill, moved instantly, their black armor scraping against the stone floor. They drew their great swords, blades specifically forged to cleave mortal bodies from their souls. Ethan gasped, pulling back, finally breaking free of Serafina's grasp. He stumbled, his eyes wide with the realization that this was the end. His mortal life, his small, precious love was over. No. Serafina screamed, her voice a sound of pure, maternal agony and desperate love. She threw herself in front of Ethan, her back to the advancing guards. You won't touch him, mother? He is mine. Lyra stood immovable, a monument of cold authority. Move, Serafina. Do not make this harder than it needs to be. Accept your failure. Serafina trembled, the despair turning into a blinding, white-hot fury. She looked into her mother's merciless eyes, and in that instant she realized she had nothing left to lose. Not her title, not her throne, not her life. Nothing mattered but the beating heart behind her and the new, hybrid heart within her. She lifted her hands, mirroring the stance of her mother on the throne, but unlike Lyra's controlled crimson glow, the power that erupted from Serafina was a violent, unpracticed burst of pure ice-blue energy. It was raw, volatile, and infinitely brighter than anything the court had ever seen. The shockwave hit the 2 guards first, not as a physical strike, but as an overwhelming psychic blow that slammed them backward, their great swords clattering uselessly onto the stone. The blue light flared, crackling around Serafina like a protective shield, momentarily pushing back the dark shadows and even dulling the crimson light of Lyra's power. Lyra's eyes widened for the first time in centuries, not in fear but in profound astonishment. She had expected defiance, not this. This was not a power she had taught her. This was something ancient, something wild, something that whispered of forgotten, primal bloodlines that preceded even the Viridian kingdom. Serafina, panting, exhausted by the single expenditure of power, looked at her mother. I won't let you kill him, she choked out. If you want him, you'll have to kill us both. Lyra stared at her daughter, at the human cowering behind her, and at the impossible blue glow. The silence returned, heavy and electric, broken only by the crackle of residual energy in the freezing air. The annihilation of Ethan was no longer a simple execution. It was now a matter of civil war. Lyra did not move. The crimson fire flickering around her hands slowly subsided, replaced by a cold, deadly calculation that was far more terrifying than her previous rage. The two royal guards, Vardis and Kalen, slowly dragged themselves upright, their powerful frames shaken by the impossible force that had slammed them back. They dared not move towards the human again, their eyes flicking between the queen and the shimmering, exhausted form of the princess. Fascinating, Lyra finally murmured, her voice stripped of emotion, chilling the blood in the air. You surprise me, Seraphina. You hide such defiance, and such a unique gift, beneath your obedience. Seraphina was struggling for breath, the sheer effort of generating that raw power having drained her to the point of collapse. Ethan, seeing the opportunity, wrapped an arm around her, supporting her weight. This changes nothing, Lyra decreed, sweeping her gaze across the hall, asserting her unwavering authority. The law is immutable. Your attachment is pathetic, but your newly revealed potential is not to be discarded. This kingdom has endured for millennia because we prize power above sentiment, and we do not waste assets. She pointed a gauntlet finger at Ethan. The immediate sentence of annihilation is rescinded. Not out of mercy for you, mortal, but out of necessity for her. Lyra shifted her gaze back to her daughter. Seraphina, you have shown your hand and you have chosen a side. The consequences of treason must still be paid. Lyra issued her commands with sharp finality, slicing the tension into brutal, manageable pieces. Vardis Kalen. Take the human. He is no longer scheduled for ash, but he is now the property of the throne. Transport him to the deepest level of the ossuary. Place him in cell 17. He will be held as collateral. And ensure he is comfortable. He must remain whole for now. He is your daughter's leash, Seraphina. Should you attempt to flee, or should you use that nascent magic against me again, his life will be forfeit swiftly and painfully. The guards moved instantly, grabbing Ethan roughly. Ethan fought against the heavy gauntlets, looking desperately back at Seraphina. Sarah, don't worry. I love you. Ethan. Seraphina screamed, reaching for him, but the guards were too strong, too fast. She tried to summon the blue light again, but the wellspring was dry, her exhaustion was absolute. She collapsed against the stone floor, sobbing as she watched the love of her life dragged away, his last sight of her being the cold floor of the judgment hall. Lyra looked down at her heir, emotionless. And you, my daughter. You will be confined to the royal tower. No visitors, no flights, no communication with anyone outside the immediate retinue. You will be monitored by the coven's most powerful seers. The child is accelerating, and the mystery of your power must be studied. You will be examined daily by Lord Forlag. You are no longer merely my daughter. You are a political variable and a magical experiment. She turned, her red cape billowing behind her, ascending the dais back to the obsidian throne. You have bought the human a few weeks of miserable life, Seraphina. Use that time to contemplate the price of your folly. The ossuary was named for its function, the deepest dungeons of the citadel where the bones of powerful foes were kept as trophies, and where the most crucial prisoners were held. Cell 17 was a small, brutally cold chamber hewn directly out of the bedrock. The air was thick with ancient despair, and the lack of sunlight was absolute, broken only by the magical torch set into the wall, casting shadows that danced like mocking spirits. Ethan sat curled on a slab of stone, shivering despite his thick jacket. He was not physically tortured, but the psychological pain was crippling. He was alive, but he had lost Seraphina, and he knew he was the direct cause of her confinement and suffering. Every moment he survived was a political weapon Lyra would wield against her daughter. Suddenly the great iron door ground open. Standing there was a figure Ethan had not yet met, Lord Forlag, the Queen's chief advisor and blood mage. Forlag was incredibly old, his skin stretched thin over a sharp skeletal frame, but his eyes glowed with keen, calculated intelligence. He wore the high black robes of the arcane coven, embroidered with runes of binding and silence. The human, Forlag hissed, his voice dry and raspy. A shame. Such a fascinating biological mistake. Forlag glided into the cell, holding a thin glass vial of shimmering violet liquid. The Queen requires certain assurances, Ethan. And the details of your connection. Ethan looked up, his voice hoarse. I have nothing to tell you. We just fell in love. Forlag chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Well, a charming mortal weakness. But the manifestation of the princess's power suggests that your bond is not so simple. The blue light boy. Seraphina's fury unleashed a resonance we have not seen in this line for thousands of years. It speaks of the Winter Moon Coven, a bloodline that was exterminated for attempting to challenge the supremacy of the Sanguine Throne. Forlag knelt, his face close to Ethan's. The Winter Moon magic is ice and defense, a stubborn resistance against the heat of pure blood. And now you, a mere human, have catalyzed its re-emergence through your progeny. You are a biological curiosity, Ethan, but a political disaster. If Seraphina manages to harness this power, the kingdom will fracture. What do you want? Ethan demanded, pushing himself back against the wall. I want stability. I want control. And I want the secret of that spark you lit, Forlag explained smoothly. You have one chance to minimize the suffering. Sign this declaration. Forlag produced a scroll, written in looping, dark script. It is a simple renunciation. You publicly renounce all claim to Seraphina and the child. You declare that you forced yourself upon the princess through mortal magic, deceiving her. You take all the blame. In exchange, the queen will grant you a quick, clean end. Seraphina will be freed from her confinement, placed back on her path to the throne, and the problem of the child will be managed internally. She lives, you die painlessly, and her name is cleared. Ethan stared at the scroll, his heart hammering in his chest. A quick death for Seraphina's freedom. It was the only merciful option he had been given since they were captured. But if he renounced the child, Lyra would simply execute the baby after it was born. He knew the ruthlessness of the queen. No, Ethan whispered, shaking his head. I won't lie about our love. And I won't give you permission to harm my son or daughter. Forlag frowned, his ancient face tightening with irritation. Foolish sentimentalism. Then you will remain Lyra's insurance policy. And I will continue to observe. You may find that pain, when administered over endless nights, is a powerful motivator for signing documents. Forlag left the vial on the stone slab, a reminder of the toxins and dark arts at his disposal, and swept out, the door slamming shut. Meanwhile, in the dizzying height of the royal tower, Seraphina stared out over the vast, darkened expanse of the kingdom. Her chambers were plush, gilded, and utterly inescapable, warded by runes that glowed faintly at the windows, preventing any escape or intrusion. She had failed. She had used her power, risked everything, and all she had earned was her own gilded cage and Ethan's prolonged torment. Her fingers clenched the satin bed sheets, and she focused her entire being on the faint, distant direction of the ossuary. She needed the blue fire back. She needed the strength not just to resist, but to shatter the very foundations of her mother's reign. She closed her eyes, trying to recall the feeling, that sudden, freezing clarity, the overwhelming certainty that she could stop anything. But it was gone, replaced by anxiety and fear. Control. We must control the cold. A strange, unfamiliar voice whispered in the back of her mind, a voice that felt ancient and feminine, like the rustle of frost on dead leaves. Seraphina gasped, her eyes snapping open. She looked around the empty room, her vampire senses stretched to their limit. Who is there? The voice did not reply, but the air in the chamber dropped 10 degrees instantly. A tiny, intricate pattern of frost, like an exploded snowflake, began to form on the smooth obsidian surface of her dressing mirror. Seraphina slowly reached out her hand towards the frost. As her fingers brushed the ice, the pain of Ethan's despair, the chill of his cell, rushed through her like a tidal wave. She felt his hopelessness, his fear, and the dark promise of Forlag's torture. The connection was fleeting but brutally real. Ethan, she whispered. The pain, rather than crushing her, focused her resolve. She pulled her hand back, the frost melting instantly. The blood in her veins was now racing, not with fear but with determination. The blue light was not a weapon of defense, it was a link. In the ossuary hundreds of feet below her, Ethan suddenly felt a momentary warmth, a fleeting sensation of fierce, protective love that cut through the absolute cold of Cell 17, making him lift his head and stare at the stone ceiling. Up above, Lyra stood on a concealed balcony overlooking the tower, watching her daughter through a crystal lens, Lord Forlag standing beside her. She felt him, Majesty, Forlag murmured, his dry voice reverent. The connection is deepening, catalyzed by the separation and the child. The power is responding to maternal instinct, not just rage. She is far more dangerous than we calculated. We must decide what is more important, the purity edict or controlling the potential of the winter moon. Lyra stared into the tower, her face inscrutable. Neither. The purity edict will be upheld and the winter moon will be controlled. She will be forced to choose, Forlag. Either she gives us the power or the human pays the final price. Lord Forlag arrived in Seraphina's private chambers in the royal tower 3 days after the confrontation, his presence chilling the opulent space further than the high altitude already did. He did not ask her to rise or offer any pleasantries. He stood beneath the massive crystal chandelier, his dark eyes radiating impatient curiosity. The Queen demands results, Princess, Forlag stated, his voice a dry rasp that grated on Seraphina's frayed nerves. The power you exhibited, that primal, blue frost, is unprecedented in the Sanguine lineage. It is a flaw, an anomaly, and we must learn how to control it or how to excise it. Seraphina was seated in a tall velvet chair, her posture stiff with defiance, even though she was still weak. I cannot simply summon it, Forlag. It came from the need to protect Ethan. It was instinct. Instinct is a terrible mistress, Forlag countered, circling her slowly. The sanguine line is defined by controlled, deliberate rage. Your father, had he possessed such a chaotic spark, would have suppressed it, shaped it into a refined crimson blade. You must replicate the moment. Feel the fury of the insult, the shame of your bloodline being sullied by a mortal. Direct that shame. He extended a hand, and a small, flickering crimson sphere of pure sanguine energy appeared above his palm. It felt hot, aggressive, demanding. Now, channel your rage, Seraphina. Strike this sphere with your frost. Show us that this power can be a weapon, not merely a petulant shield. Seraphina stared at the sphere, trying to twist her despair and fear into the pure, cutting rage that fueled her mother's power. She thought of Lyra's cruel decree, of Ethan in the freezing darkness, but the attempt failed. Instead of the searing blue light, a thin, pathetic sheet of harmless mist formed around her hands and quickly dissipated. Forlag sighed dramatically. Pathetic. The human has made you weak, princess. Your emotions are muddy. You cling to the human's fleeting existence, and that softness prevents the clean, sharp edge of the frost. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial menace. You should know the conditions in the ossuary are taxing. The cold, the isolation. Mortality is fragile, Seraphina. It takes surprisingly little to break a human spirit, and even less to stop a human heart. If you cannot give the queen what she needs, I might suggest that the quickest way to find the necessary rage is to lose what little you hold dear. The veiled threat, rather than summoning anger, triggered an acute wave of protective anguish. It was the crushing certainty that Ethan was suffering right now that finally breached the wall. Seraphina closed her eyes, not to find rage, but to find the cold, fragile connection she had felt days before. She reached out not to strike but to guard. Suddenly the cold was back. It rushed through her, but this time it was cleaner, clearer. It felt like standing on a frozen lake, vast and unyielding. She saw not the room but a flash of deep, unrelenting blackness, the smell of damp earth and bone, Ethan's cell. She felt his cold skin, his desperate isolation. Instead of a blast, a fine layer of sparkling, needle-like frost erupted from her fingertips and coated the stone balustrade of the balcony. It was silent, beautiful, and utterly lethal. The cold was a solid, focused extension of her will, a defense mechanism made manifest. Forlag recoiled immediately, recognizing the danger. The red sanguine sphere fizzled out. A directed cold. Not explosive but binding. The winter moon's true signature. But why now? Why the focus? Seraphina opened her eyes, panting. I don't hate him, Forlag. I love him. The power is not rage, it is defiance. It is the need to protect the life I created, against the death you represent. Forlag's lips curled in a tight, calculating smile. Well, a variable we can work with. If the threat of the human unlocks this potential, then we simply make the threat permanent. Well done, Seraphina. You have bought the mortal another day of life. Down in the ossuary, Ethan was enduring his own battle. He hadn't been physically harmed, but the hunger, the extreme cold, and the knowledge that his fate was tied to Seraphina's emotional state were wearing him down. The brief flash of warmth he had felt during Sarah's attempt had vanished quickly, but the memory was a lifeline. It proved she was fighting. Forlag visited Ethan later that night, bringing with him only a flask of chilled, clear water and a long, sharp instrument used for extracting bone marrow, a chilling, silent threat. The princess is making progress, Ethan, Forlag informed him, taking a slow sip of the water and then setting the flask just out of Ethan's reach. She can summon the cold when she thinks of you. Your suffering is her inspiration. Tell me, human, what is it about your connection that overrides centuries of blood discipline? Is it some primitive human pheromone? A charm? Ethan's throat was dry, but he focused on the faint, residual warmth he remembered. It's nothing you can understand, Forlag. She feels the truth in my heart. The coldness you value, the power you seek, it's empty. It's what drove her away from the throne and toward me. Forlag's eyes glowed dangerously. Truth. Always seeking the simple, obvious narrative. I believe you are the anchor, Ethan. A mortal anchor preventing the princess from floating back into her true orbit. But anchors can be cut. He picked up the sharp instrument, running a fingertip along the edge. Your bones are surprisingly rich in marrow. I am considering studying the effects of controlled pain on her newfound power. Will it amplify her protective instinct, or shatter it entirely? Ethan looked past the mage, focusing instead on the invisible barrier separating him from Seraphina. He wouldn't beg, he wouldn't lie, and he wouldn't break. Do what you must. But you will lose her, and you will lose her power. She will never forgive you. Forlag chuckled, setting the instrument down again. A brave statement for a dying man. But I suppose we shall see. He left, his presence leaving the cell colder and heavier than before. As the days turned into nights, Seraphina dedicated herself to the frost. She learned that intense focus, paired with a powerful protective instinct for Ethan, was the key. She could now trace intricate frost patterns on the windows, creating small, temporary wards. She was no longer Lyra's prisoner. She was the architect of her own containment, learning the rules before she broke them. Her only respite came from the visits of Lady Ilara. Ilara was Lyra's personal attendant, a vampire of lower nobility who had served Seraphina as a playmate during her childhood. Ilara was dutiful, quiet, and seemingly loyal to the queen. Now she was tasked with bringing Sarah her daily meal and taking away the used silver trays. One evening, Ilara entered the room, her eyes cast down, her movements stiff. She placed the tray on the table and quickly adjusted the heavy, centuries-old tapestry depicting the first king of Viridia, which hung near the fireplace. As she did so, she subtly dropped a small, carved piece of granite onto Seraphina's lap, hidden by the folds of the deep purple gown. Seraphina's hands shot out and closed around the object. It was cold, strangely warm to her touch, and etched with a faint, spiraling pattern. Ilara did not look at her, merely curtsied and left, her face a mask of subservience. Seraphina stared at the stone, turning it over in her palm. It wasn't just a carving, it was a sigil. A symbol of the Whispering Watchers, an old, secret order within the castle that maintained the lesser, often forgotten passages. The spiraling line was a map, and the granite itself was charged with a faint, countermagical energy, enough to briefly disrupt a low-level ward. The sigil led her gaze back to the tapestry Ilara had adjusted. The king's stern face was woven above a grand and used marble fireplace. The map on the stone clearly indicated a passage behind the hearth, leading down to the level that housed the ancient royal archives, a much less guarded part of the citadel. This was not just help, it was betrayal against the queen. Ilara had risked annihilation to give Seraphina this chance. Seraphina spent the next hour examining the runes on her door and windows, the magical wards that sealed her in. They were Lyra's design, powerful and aggressive. But the frost power had given Seraphina a new insight. If she focused the cold not as a weapon, but as a dense shield of non-conduction, she might be able to nullify the wards briefly. She pressed the granite sigil against the heavy marble mantelpiece, channeling the controlled, icy power into it. The stone responded instantly, humming with cold energy. She felt the ancient stone vibrating, and slowly, silently, the entire hearth, tapestry and all, began to pivot inward, revealing a gap of profound blackness and the smell of dust and old parchment. The passage was open. It was time to move. But before she could step through, the sound of heavy boots and the rhythmic clink-clink of Lyra's armored cape chains echoed loudly from the stone staircase leading to her tower door. Lyra was coming for a surprise inspection. Seraphina knew she had seconds. If Lyra saw the passage, saw the sigil, or even smelled the faint trace of frost in the air, Ilara would be executed, Ethan would be killed immediately, and Seraphina herself would be physically chained. With a final desperate burst of willpower, Seraphina pushed herself through the gap, clutching the granite sigil tightly. The passage closed silently behind her just as the lock on the heavy oak door of her chamber began to turn. The moment the marble hearth slid shut, the heavy thud of the royal tower door swinging open echoed through the thick stone walls. Seraphina was plunged into absolute darkness, barely managing to keep her balance on the steep, narrow stone steps of the hidden passage. She heard the chilling resonance of Lyra's fury from the other side, muffled but unmistakable. "Where is she?" Lyra's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. The sound of heavy armor and the scrape of Forlag's robes followed. "The wards are intact, Majesty." Forlag sounded incredulous. "No flight, no breach. She cannot have simply vanished." "She has not vanished, Forlag. She has escaped," Lyra retorted, her voice rising to a terrible pitch that vibrated the very stones around Seraphina. "Find the seam. Find the weakness. Tear this chamber apart. Vardis, Kalen. Alert the perimeter guard. Double the patrols around the ossuary. She is going for the human." Seraphina moved quickly, driven by the urgency of that last command. Lyra knew her intent. Every second she wasted meant Ethan's immediate jeopardy. The passage was claustrophobic, smelling of dust, cold mortar, and the dry metallic tang of ancient blood, the signature scent of the citadel's foundations. She slid down the last few steps, finding herself in a vast, silent chamber. This was the royal archives, a sprawling underground maze of vaulted ceilings and endless rows of carved wooden shelves, stacked high with scrolls and tomes detailing the entire history of Viridia. It was guarded not by brute force, but by magical secrecy and the sheer intimidating complexity of its layout. The only illumination came from self-sustaining, crystalline orbs placed sparsely along the walls, casting long, distorted shadows of the towering shelves. Seraphina immediately recognized a low, continuous thrumming sound, the passive wards. These were not aggressive wards designed to attack, but surveillance wards designed to report any movement above a certain energy signature back to the central Coven hub. Any vampire using speed, strength, or noticeable magic would instantly trigger a security lockdown. She had to be silent, slow, and cold. Clutching the granite sigil, Serafina moved between the shelves. Her training, usually focused on battlefield command and political maneuvering, now served her with a new, unexpected focus. She moved with the silent, predatory grace of her species, but her mind was entirely focused on suppressing her internal heat, the natural warmth of her sanguine blood. She channeled the icy power, letting a fine invisible film of frost wrap around her skin. It dulled her internal energy, lowering her signature to that of an inert object, effectively turning her into a ghost. As she turned a corner, she froze. Two low-ranking archive guards, their uniforms the dull brown of the scholarly class, stood near a reading alcove, their heads bent over a large ancient map. They were gossiping. "They say the Queen's fury is beyond measure," one whispered. "The princess, with a human. It's an insult to the first king." "I heard Lord Forlag is already preparing a ritual," the other replied, fear lacing his tone. "Not for the human but for the child. A sanctification ritual to burn the mortal blood out." Serafina pressed herself against the cold shelves, the horrific information spiking her terror and rage. Forlag wasn't planning on killing the child after birth, he was planning a magical abortion, a violation of life that was even illegal by Viridian standards. This was Lyra's true intention for the child, to purify the bloodline at any cost. The thought of the ritual, of her unborn child being subjected to the blood mage's purifying fire, sent a violent surge of energy through her. This was not protective instinct, it was pure, targeted hatred. The blue light flared around her hands, uncontrollable this time, turning the air around her into a visible cloud of white vapor. "No, too much," Serafina mentally screamed. The powerful surge was moments from triggering the wards and alerting the entire citadel. She slammed her mind down on the power, focusing on the cold, not the energy. Defense. Silence. Stillness. She crushed the fiery emotion, letting the freezing clarity take over. The energy didn't vanish, it transformed. Instead of a volatile blast, the blue fire turned into a dense, silent field of absolute coldness. It coated the air around the guards, muffling their voices and even slowing the rate of the dust motes spinning in the crystal light. The guards suddenly shivered, rubbing their arms. "Did you feel that?" "A draft," one mumbled, looking around. "The archives are always cold. Come on, let's finish this manifest. I don't want to be caught here if the Queen starts searching this level." They left, oblivious to the fact that their princess had been inches away, protected by a silent, freezing shroud. Serafina exhaled a shuddering breath, the exertion leaving her trembling. She had controlled it. The winter moon power wasn't just ice, it was the ultimate tool for stealth and denial. She moved deeper into the archives, realizing the passage she took was meant for quick, covert access to the ancient treaties section, which housed information that Lyra often needed for political leverage. She finally found the section, marked by two intimidating, unlit obsidian sentinels. She scanned the ancient texts, desperately looking for anything that referenced the ossuary's structure or, better yet, the Whisperer's sigil. She flipped through crumbling parchment until she found a heavily cross-referenced, rarely touched tome, The Sublevel Foundations, a study of Citadel Geowards. The Whisperer sigil was etched on the first page, marked as a control point for lower-level pressure seals. The text described how a network of forgotten, pre-sanguine maintenance tunnels ran beneath the ossuary, used long ago to manage the underground geothermal vents. More importantly, it detailed the ossuary's single, massive security flaw, the ventilation shaft. The shaft was essential for removing the toxic residual decay from the collected bones and ran directly from the deepest cell block, the ossuary's lowest level, up to an external heavily disguised vent cover on the remote north cliff face. The shaft was too small for a vampire in full armor, but for Serafina, who could shrink her frame and control her internal temperature, it was a terrifyingly plausible route. The text also confirmed that Cell 17, Ethan's prison, was located directly beside the main ventilation exchange. She had her target, but the Citadel's defenses were now screaming. A distant gong rang 3 times, the Queen's signal for a full high-priority search. She found a final, crucial detail, a hidden, sub-level access point in the archive's floor, disguised beneath a stone depicting the Second King's seal. This point led directly into the maintenance tunnel system, bypassing the heavily guarded main entrance of the ossuary. With renewed purpose, Serafina knelt, placed the granite sigil on the floor, and once again channeled the freezing cold. This time the floor didn't open, it thinned. The stone seal of the king began to haze and grow fragile, brittle with absolute cold. With a single silent push of her armored boot, the chilled stone crumbled into flakes of ice and dust, revealing a dark hole and a ladder descending into a tunnel network. She was moments away from the ossuary, but she had to send Ethan a message. A simple, impossible one. Focusing with all her mental power, she channeled the blue cold towards the depth where Ethan lay. She did not send a thought or a word, but a simple, pure image, the North Cliff face. A ladder. Skip. In cell 17, Ethan was huddled on the cold stone, almost accepting the inevitable defeat. He hadn't seen Forelag, the guards, or even a ray of light in hours. The entire citadel felt silent, but a deep vibration, the high-priority search alarm, told him something massive was happening. Suddenly, a sensation unlike anything he had felt before rushed into his mind. It wasn't sound and it wasn't thought. It was a perfectly rendered, three-dimensional image, the dizzying height of a sheer cliff face under the twin moons and a narrow metal vent cover. Below it, a ladder. The image was perfectly clear, carrying with it a profound, bone-deep cold that momentarily paralyzed him, but was instantly followed by a familiar, powerful surge of love. She is coming. Ethan looked at the small, narrow ventilation duct grill high on the wall, something he had dismissed as useless. He stood up, his mortal fear replaced by an electric, reckless hope. He was a human, he was weak. But Serafina was risking everything, shattering the foundations of her home for him and their child. He would not wait to be rescued. He began to search his cell for anything, a loose stone, a shard of metal, anything to pry open that ventilation grill. He had to be ready when she arrived. The maintenance tunnels beneath the archives were a labyrinth of cold, damp stone and tangled, rusted pipes, the forgotten arteries of the citadel. Serafina moved through them with a mixture of predatory focus and deep nausea, the confinement and the strange, rushing energies of the underground vents challenging her pregnant state. The air was thick and metallic, smelling of sulfur and wet rock, and the passages were barely wide enough for her armored shoulders. Her only guide was the ancient knowledge detailed in the foundation texts and the faint, humming presence of the granite sigil in her hand, which pointed the way down. She was descending towards the geothermal vent system, the only part of the citadel that actively fought against the freezing temperatures of the mountain, a place rarely trod by the Queen's blood coven, who preferred the dry, stable cold of the upper levels. She reached a section where the pipes were visibly cracked and spewing clouds of scalding steam, the hiss deafening and the heat oppressive, a serious threat to her sanguine nature, which was optimized for the cold. She knew Lyra's coven rarely maintained this area, it was a perfect choke point. She had to pass through it quickly. Recalling the control she had achieved in the archives, Serafina focused not on moving past the heat, but on neutralizing it. She extended her hand towards the rupture, channeling the blue frost power with precise, surgical intent. The sound of the steam instantly dropped in pitch, followed by a sharp, cracking sound as the scalding water instantly solidified into a beautiful, complex formation of crystalline ice. The heat in the tunnel vanished, replaced by a refreshing, sudden cold. The ice plug was absolute, sealing the pipe with silent, profound control. Serafina moved past the frozen steam effortlessly, the defensive nature of the winter moon power proving its superior utility against the raw, uncontrolled power of the sanguine fire. She was no longer just running, she was adapting to the environment, twisting the citadel's own weaknesses into strengths. Up in the royal tower, Lyra stood amidst the wreckage of Serafina's private chamber, her silver armor shimmering in the emergency torchlight. Forelag was kneeling by the closed hearth, running his hands over the stone where the passage had been. She used a whisperer sigil, Majesty, Forelag confirmed, his face pale with fury. A maintenance exit in the archives. She is in the tunnels. It is clear, her intent is to reach the ossuary. The human, Lyra snarled, kicking a piece of shattered marble across the room. He is a disease. He is distracting her from her nature. Forelag, this cannot be allowed to escalate. If she reaches him and they escape, the power of the winter moon will be lost to us, and the political fallout will be catastrophic. The tunnels are difficult, Majesty, but she is pregnant and likely exhausted, Forelag reasoned, standing up. We must not commit the main guard. We must send trackers who can match her subtlety. I will dispatch the Coven blood hunters. They are specialized in scent tracking and low-signature energy detection. They will catch her before she breaches the ossuary's main defenses. Lyra stared out the warded window, her crimson eyes narrowed to slits. Then send them, Forelag. And send a message to the ossuary captain. If the princess breaches the cell block, the human is to be executed immediately. No hesitation, no delay. If she wants him, she must accept the price of her disobedience. In cell 17, Ethan's knuckles were bleeding, raw and red against the black stone wall. He had found a sliver of rusted iron beneath the thin cot, likely a forgotten part of a guard's chain, and had been working desperately on the ventilation grill. The grill was ancient, Its screws fused with decades of oxidation, but his human persistence was surprisingly effective. The high-priority search alarm was still vibrating through the bedrock, making the stone hum. He knew the search was for Serafina. He knew he was the center of this hurricane. He pushed the iron sliver into the narrow gap beneath the grill and levered it up with a silent grunt of effort. The metal shrieked against the stone, a terrifyingly loud sound in the absolute quiet of the deep dungeon. He froze, listening intently. No sound from the corridor. The cell blocks were designed for absolute silence, but the guards were always listening. Just a little more, he urged himself. He looked at the dim light cast by the magic lamp, holding the psychic image of the North Cliff escape route in his mind. He needed that vent open before she arrived. With a final desperate twist, one side of the grill sprung loose with a terrifying clang that echoed briefly through the chamber. Ethan scrambled to catch the heavy metal grate before it hit the floor, muffling its fall against his chest. He shoved it silently under his cot. The opening was small, barely a foot wide, but it was a hole. A connection to the outside world, a potential path to freedom. Serafina followed the maintenance tunnel until it opened into a dizzying vertical shaft. This was the main service point, a massive chamber filled with humming machinery, gears, and, most importantly, ventilation ducts, the exchange. It was loud, chaotic, and completely unguarded because the noise alone was believed to be defense enough. The tunnel she had used opened directly onto a walkway high above the main floor, which was now dominated by a complex web of massive rotating fans that drove the air up from the cells below and out to the surface vent. The entire room smelled strongly of decay and disinfectant, the direct output of the ossuary's lowest levels. She knew cell 17 was directly behind the thick wall opposite her. She heard something else too, a faint, low hissing sound, the subtle signature of the Coven bloodhunters. They were close, moving through the lower archive tunnels, tracking the residual cold signature left by her passage. Serafina had no time for stealth now. She had to disable the exchange. She looked at the network of fans, huge blades spinning at lethal speed. She directed the frost power not as a blast, but as an absolute drain of thermal energy. She attacked the fan's central gears simultaneously, freezing the lubricants, the metal, and the very air around the central axis. The humming cacophony of the exchange died instantly, replaced by a deafening metallic screech as the immense gears seized up. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The lack of noise was now the biggest alert. Serafina leaped from the walkway, landing silently on the stone floor. She ran to the wall opposite her, recognizing the subtle vibration of the cells. She found the point where the largest ventilation duct emerged from the wall, the point that led to the cell level. She tapped the stone near the duct, a quick rhythmic tap-tap, tap-tap. The signal they had used as children, a promise of a secret shared. On the other side of the wall, Ethan, kneeling by the gaping hole where the vent used to be, heard the faint, muffled sound. His heart leaped, but he hesitated, fearing a guard trick. Serafina tapped again, more urgently this time, pouring her intent into the sound. "It's me. Are you ready?" Ethan pressed his mouth to the hole, his voice a dry, ragged whisper. "Sarah. Yes, I'm here." The grill is open. Relief, so powerful it threatened to shatter her control, washed over Serafina. He was alive. He was ready. She pressed her palm flat against the cold stone, right where his voice had come from, and whispered back, her own voice barely audible above the ringing silence of the seized fans. "Ethan, the hunters are coming. I need you to do exactly as I say. I'm going to freeze this section of the wall. When it shatters, you must move. Run to the ladder, North Cliff. We go together right now." She felt the residual warmth of his presence through the wall, the warmth of his beating, human heart. It was the only counterpoint to the terrifying cold she was about to unleash. Gathering all the power she had cultivated since her imprisonment, Serafina focused the winter moon's energy. She was not aiming for a fissure. She was aiming for absolute structural disintegration. The blue light flared around her, casting the exchange in a ghostly, crystalline glow. She was going to shatter the foundations of the ossuary and break the entire citadel's defense. From the tunnel she had used, she heard the unmistakable scrape of armored boots and the hiss of the bloodhunters' energy whips. They had reached the exchange. She braced herself, pushing the freezing power into the stone. The wall began to groan, cracking under the impossible, instant pressure of absolute cold. The granite sigil in Serafina's hand vibrated violently, channeling the raw, destructive focus of her winter moon power into the stone of the ossuary wall. She wasn't just freezing the wall, she was manipulating the very crystalline structure of the bedrock, forcing it to expand and contract simultaneously. The wall opposite the ventilation duct exploded. It was not a violent, loud blast, but a silent, brittle implosion, the stone shattering into millions of razor-sharp shards of ice and dust. The sound of the collapse was instantly devoured by the sudden, profound silence of the seized ventilation fans. Through the gaping, smoking hole, Serafina saw him. Ethan was standing in cell 17, his mortal form frail but resolute, holding the heavy metal grate in his hand. His eyes, wide with fear and hope, met hers. "Now, Ethan. Through the vent. Go." Serafina screamed, her voice hoarse, pointing past him to the small dark opening in the wall behind his cot, the exit to the North Cliff shaft. But their reunion was violently interrupted. The Coven blood hunters, 3 figures cloaked in black leather and armed with wicked, energized whips, burst into the exchange chamber. Their leader, a scarred, feral vampire named Raxus, saw the breached wall and the princess. His crimson eyes glowed with the thrill of the hunt. "There. The princess. Don't let the human escape. The queen demands her alive, but the human is forfeit." Raxus roared, cracking his whip. The whip was not made of leather but of concentrated, sizzling energy, striking the floor right next to Serafina with a deafening snap. Serafina moved instantly, throwing herself into the breach towards Ethan. The second hunter, Valens, leaped onto the wall, aiming a powerful kick at Serafina's exposed flank. Serafina didn't dodge. She used her body as a shield, letting the blow land, the pain sharp and sickening, but the force of the kick propelled her towards Ethan. "Behind me now," she ordered, pulling Ethan through the hole and pushing him towards the vent. Ethan, his cartographer's training making him acutely aware of heights and enclosed spaces, didn't hesitate. He dropped to his hands and knees and squeezed his body through the narrow opening, disappearing into the darkness of the vertical shaft. Raxus screamed in fury, scaling the rubble. "The human is in the shaft. Valens, cover the hole. Kalen, follow me. We take the princess." Serafina whirled to face the hunters, her arms instinctively going around her swollen abdomen, protecting the life inside. She was weak, trapped in the rubble, and facing 2 superior, heavily armed opponents, but the presence of her child, the living proof of her defiance, filled her with a cold, desperate resolve. "You won't touch him," she snarled, her eyes flaring with a blue, freezing light. Valens, the hunter by the hole, hesitated, remembering the raw power she had displayed in the judgment hall. Raxus, however, was pure aggression. He cracked his whip again, the energized tip wrapping around Serafina's arm. The searing pain, made worse by the electrical nature of the whip, forced a guttural cry from her lips. Serafina retaliated instantly, channeling the absolute zero of the winter moon into the section of the whip wrapped around her arm. The energy whip instantly cooled, the sizzling current replaced by a thick sheath of frost. With a powerful tug, Serafina snapped the crystallized whip free, the frozen section shattering into harmless dust. Raxus gaped at the impossible negation of his most lethal weapon. Serafina used the moment. She slammed her foot down onto a large, jagged piece of rubble and channeled the frost into it. The stone shard turned into a dense, fast-moving projectile of ice. It flew towards Valens, striking him hard on the chest plate. The hunter cried out as the force of the blow, combined with the extreme cold, paralyzed the armor's kinetic shielding. He staggered backward, momentarily incapacitated. "The cold is a shield, not a blade," Raxus roared, correcting his strategy. He abandoned his whip and charged Serafina, aiming for a brutal physical takedown, using his own superior strength to overwhelm her. Serafina knew she couldn't win a sustained physical fight in her condition. As Raxus tackled her, slamming her into the thick wall of the exchange, she focused her power not on him but on the environment. She thrust her hands onto the wall, pushing the winter moon power outwards. The intense cold rushed through the stone, radiating into the huge chamber. Within seconds the entire exchange, the walls, the floor, the massive, unmoving gears, was slicked with a thick, impossibly treacherous layer of black ice. Raxus, his momentum carrying him forward, suddenly found his feet had no purchase. He stumbled, his huge armored body sliding violently across the frozen floor, crashing headlong into the base of the seized fan housing. He was dazed but not defeated. "Go to the shaft, you fool." Serafina screamed at him, still pinned against the wall by the impact of his tackle. "You'll lose him." Raxus struggled to his feet, enraged by the deception. He understood Serafina's intent. She was trading herself for time. He turned, ignoring the princess, and began to slide towards the gaping hole in the cell wall. Before he could reach it, a small metallic object shot out from the hole and slammed into his thigh, Ethan's heavy metal vent grill. It was a weak, mortal blow, but it knocked Raxus off balance on the slick ice, sending him tumbling back toward the massive, seized gears. "Get out of here, Sarah." Ethan's muffled shout came from the dark shaft. Serafina, seeing her opportunity, shoved Raxus off her and scrambled to the hole. She looked back one last time. Raxus was trying to crawl back to the vent, pulling himself along the wall. Valens was slowly regaining his footing, his chest aching from the ice projectile. The hunters were temporarily defeated, but they would be on them within minutes. "I love you," she whispered, a silent promise, and plunged headfirst into the vertical shaft after Ethan. The ventilation shaft was a terrifying drop into absolute darkness, barely 6 feet in diameter. Ethan was already a few feet below her, scrambling down the narrow, rusted rungs of the maintenance ladder that was barely affixed to the wall. "Hurry, Sarah. The ladder is old," Ethan yelled, his voice echoing in the shaft. Serafina began her descent. She couldn't use her full vampire speed. The brittle ladder and her heavy form meant she had to be careful. Above them, the hunters were beginning to clear the breach. Suddenly, a massive, resonating sound echoed from the top of the shaft. Lyra's voice, amplified by the Citadel's internal communication system. "Serafina, stop. Your actions are treasonous. Your life is forfeit. Do not take another step. If the human survives, I swear by the blood of the first king, I will use every instrument of war against the mortal settlements. I will end your lineage. The entire valley will burn for his freedom." The threat was not personal, it was political. Lyra was using the ultimate leverage, the lives of countless innocent humans. Ethan froze on the ladder. "Sarah, we have to stop. She means it. We can't cause a massacre." Serafina looked down at her husband, at the desperation in his mortal eyes. She was a princess, and the weight of a kingdom was on her shoulders, even in rebellion. But she was also a mother. The sanctity of the child, the hybrid life, was paramount. "She is lying, Ethan," Serafina shouted back, descending with renewed ferocity. "She would have done that already. She needs me alive. She needs this power. Don't let her fear control you. Keep moving. We have to get to the surface." She reached him, placing a stabilizing hand on his back. "We don't run to the human lands. We run to the neutral lands. We hide until the child is born and then we fight for our future. Now go." Above them, the faint sound of Raxus entering the shaft sent a new wave of fear. "They're in the shaft." Ethan screamed, scrambling down faster, his bloodied hands slipping on the cold metal. Serafina used the last of her strength to channel the frost power one more time. She wasn't strong enough to freeze the entire shaft, but she was strong enough to attack the integrity of the ladder above her. A section of the ladder above Raxus suddenly crumbled into dust and ice, sending the hunter plummeting down the shaft with a terrifying scream and a deafening crash as he hit the bottom of the exchange floor. The passage was clear. They reached the bottom of the shaft, a narrow horizontal passage that Serafina recognized from the text as the final output. She used the granite sigil to quickly unlatch the final external vent. A breath of fresh, freezing night air hit them, carrying the scent of pine and distant mountain snow. They scrambled through the narrow opening, emerging onto the sheer, cold face of the north cliff, high above the valley floor. The twin moons of Viridia hung immense and watchful in the night sky. They were free, but they were hunted, and their freedom had just cost an elite hunter his life. Serafina scrambled out of the narrow vent opening, her lungs burning, her heavily pregnant body protesting every violent movement. The cold night air was a shock after the stale heat of the shaft, but the sheer, exhilarating height of the north cliff face offered a brutal sense of freedom. Ethan followed, tumbling onto the narrow ledge beside her, coughing and clutching his bloodied hands. They stood pinned against the sheer rock, the citadel looming behind and above them, a black, monstrous crown against the starlit sky. Below, the vast, shadowy expanse of the Valley of Whispers stretched towards the distant, twinkling lights of the mortal settlements, the very villages Lyra had just threatened. "We have to move, Sarah." "No. They'll sweep the entire cliff face," Ethan urged, gripping her arm. "They won't find us easily," Serafina whispered, channeling her exhaustion and adrenaline into the frost power. She pressed her hand against the vent cover, the metal instantly coating in a thick, dense layer of ice that fused it completely shut and made the vent invisible against the frost-covered rock. "The cold hides my trail and my power has blinded their trackers for now." They descended the cliff using narrow, forgotten maintenance footings, their movements slow and agonizingly exposed. Serafina moved with the unnatural strength of her species, but the drain of the frost power and the strain of her pregnancy was beginning to take a heavy toll. Her legs ached and her breath came in ragged gasps. As they reached the tree line, a vast ancient forest known as the Shadowwood, Serafina had to stop. She leaned heavily against a massive snow-dusted pine, her eyes squeezed shut as a wave of dizziness washed over her. "Sarah, what is it?" Ethan knelt instantly, fear replacing urgency. "The child," she choked out, placing a protective hand on her abdomen. The baby was moving, not with the playful kicks of before, but with a fierce, almost violent internal shudder that sent spasms of pain through her. "The power, the constant use. It's accelerating the process. It's feeding on the raw emotion, the stress. I feel like I have days, not weeks." Ethan's face, pale and streaked with dirt, was filled with despair. He was a human. He was a cartographer, not a midwife or a warrior. His skills were useless against the mystical acceleration of a hybrid pregnancy. "We need to get you to safety. Not just hide, we need help," Ethan insisted. Lyra's threat, she meant it about the villages. "But we can't stop. We have to reach the neutral zone. The old sanctuary. It's too far, but it's the only place they won't dare trespass immediately." The neutral zone was a barren, magically cursed area far beyond the Shadowwood, established centuries ago as a demilitarized border between Lyra's kingdom and the few remaining free vampire houses. Lyra respected the line only out of fear of sparking a full-scale war. They pressed on using the dense cover of the Shadowwood. As they traveled, Seraphina's mind raced. They needed more than sanctuary, they needed knowledge. She needed to understand the power of the winter moon and how it related to her child, before it tore them both apart. Suddenly, a sound interrupted the rustling of the forest, not the heavy boots of the sanguine hunters, but a subtle, almost musical chime, coming from a clearing ahead. "Wait. Stop," Seraphina hissed, pulling Ethan behind a thicket of thorns. "That's not Lyra's guard. That's a house sigil. It's the chime of the House of Viridian Whispers." This was the same hidden society that Alara had belonged to, the group of dissenters who maintained the secret passages. Seraphina realized they hadn't been acting alone. They had paved the way for her escape. In the clearing beneath the high, dark canopy stood Lady Alara. She was no longer in the simple black robes of a personal attendant. She wore the muted gray armor of a field agent, and she held a thin, silver rod that glowed faintly, emitting the chime that had led Seraphina to her. With her stood a tall, hooded male figure, equally clad in muted armor. "Princess Seraphina. We knew you would make it," Alara whispered, stepping forward. "Alara, you risked everything." "What?" Seraphina demanded, stepping into the clearing, pulling Ethan with her. "The Queen's madness must end," Alara said simply, her eyes filled with cold determination. "Lyra has become obsessed with the purity of the blood, discarding her own future for pride. The Whispers believe the true strength of Viridia lies not in cold control, but in adaptation. Your child is not an abomination, it is the next step." She gestured to the hooded figure. "This is Cyrus, one of our best. He is a master of the forbidden lore. He knows the history of the Winter Moon Coven." Cyrus stepped forward, his eyes shielded by shadow. "The Winter Moon Coven were not destroyed by the Sanguine for being weak, Seraphina. They were destroyed because their power, the power of absolute cold, was the only force that could neutralize the Sanguine's fire magic. Their magic comes from balance, not bloodlust. Lyra fears what she cannot burn. My child is being harmed by the power. It is accelerating the pregnancy," Seraphina explained urgently. "The Sanguine blood is fighting the Winter Moon power for dominance. The stress is forcing the child to mature before its time," Cyrus confirmed. "You are trying to control it through rage and protection, but the Winter Moon requires acceptance. You must embrace the cold, not fight it, and you must stabilize the child's growth. Lyra is already on the move. She won't wait for you to reach the neutral zone." Alara extended a satchel. "We have supplied you with mortal rations for the human, and rare blood essence that will strengthen you, but will not affect the child's hybrid nature. More importantly, we have a deceleration sigil." She pulled out a small ornate silver brooch engraved with symbols of ice and starlight. "This sigil was crafted by the original Winter Moon mages. It will stabilize the child and give you the time you need, but it must be applied immediately. And you must not stop moving for more than an hour." Seraphina took the satchel and the sigil, her hands trembling. This was a direct, open declaration of war on her mother, but it was the only path to saving her child. "Ethan," Seraphina said, turning to her husband. "We need to reach the neutral zone, but first, the sigil." They found a small, secluded grove. While Alara and Cyrus stood guard, Seraphina, guided by the instructions from Cyrus, carefully pressed the silver brooch onto her skin, right above the pregnant swell of her abdomen. As the silver touched her skin, a blindingly cold blue light emanated from the sigil. It wasn't painful but intensely cold, flooding her body with a sensation of profound stillness. The chaotic, violent movement of the baby immediately ceased, replaced by a calm, deep rhythm. The draining fatigue eased instantly. The deceleration sigil had worked. "We have bought ourselves time," Seraphina declared, feeling the familiar, steady power of the frost settle within her, now calm and controlled. "Lyra will be using her fastest airborne scouts. We need a way to travel quickly and undetected." Cyrus pointed towards a hidden, moss-covered ridge running along the edge of the forest. "There is an old Whisperer route. It leads to the ancient trade bridge. If you can cross it, you will shave 2 days off the journey to the neutral zone. But be warned, the bridge is heavily warded and only appears when the blood of a royal is spilled upon the central stone. Ethan looked at Serafina. A blood price just to cross a bridge? This is insane. It is the only way, Serafina confirmed, her eyes meeting Ethan's, now clear and resolute. I have the blood of the royal coven, and I now have the clarity of the winter moon. Alara Cyrus, thank you. We will not fail. With the deceleration sigil calming her body and the map from Cyrus guiding them, Serafina and Ethan left the Shadow Wood, heading for the dangerous, warded bridge, knowing that Lyra's fastest trackers were already hot on their trail. Serafina and Ethan left the cover of the Shadow Wood, now moving across the treacherous, uneven terrain of the borderlands. The deceleration sigil worked with quiet, cold efficiency, maintaining a steady, rhythmic stillness within Serafina's abdomen. The relief was immense, giving her clarity of mind, but the sigil demanded a constant, subtle drain of her life force to sustain its anti-magic field. Their immediate destination was a landmark Serafina knew well from ancient maps: the Sentinel Gorge, the ravine where the ancient trade bridge was said to appear. The bridge was a relic of the old kingdoms, a structure that existed only in a magically veiled state, designed to be unusable by the common populace and accessible only through a blood price, a sign of sovereignty and sacrifice. As they reached the edge of the gorge, the scale of the obstacle was breathtaking. A massive, misty chasm plunged thousands of feet into absolute darkness, and the wind screaming through it carried shards of ice and dust. Across the void, a sheer, unclimbable cliff face marked the beginning of the neutral zone. There was no visible bridge, only the swirling, freezing void. Serafina located the activation stone, a large, flat slab of black basalt set into the rock face at the gorge's edge. The stone was covered in faded, intricate runes that pulsed faintly with dormant magic. This is it, Serafina stated, pulling the dagger Alara had given her, a ceremonial silver blade used by the Whisperers. The bridge requires the sacrifice of royal blood to be anchored. It needs the heat of the sanguine fire to burn through the veil. Ethan's eyes were wide with fear, not of the height but of the self-inflicted wound. Sarah, no. That's too much risk. The healing process will drain you, especially with the sigil active. I have no choice, she countered, her voice firm. Lyra's trackers will be here by dawn. We need distance. This will be a single, quick cut. I have to believe the winter moon power will aid the healing. She lifted the dagger and pressed the cold, silver tip against the sensitive inner curve of her forearm. She channeled her resolve, ignoring the mortal fear in Ethan's eyes. With a sharp, controlled inhale, she sliced the blade across her skin, opening a deep, clean wound. The wound immediately bled, the rich, crimson royal blood steaming slightly in the freezing air. She pressed the wound against the basalt slab, letting a generous quantity of her blood soak into the cold, rune-etched stone. For a moment nothing happened. Then the runes on the stone flared, not with the queen's aggressive crimson, but with a mix of blue frost and deep red, the volatile synergy of sanguine and winter moon blood. The dual magic ignited the dormant wards. The air above the chasm began to shimmer, violently at first, then coalescing into a transparent, shimmering structure. The swirling mist and wind stilled, pushed away by a field of pure magical energy. A bridge of solid, dark obsidian appeared, anchored to the basalt stone and stretching across the dizzying void to the neutral zone. It was narrow, slick with frost, and completely exposed, but it was their path. We have to cross now. The magic won't hold forever, Serafina urged, binding the wound tightly with a cloth strip from her cloak. She could already feel the heavy drain of the healing process competing with the deceleration sigil, but the frost power was subtly reinforcing her blood vessels, slowing the loss. They stepped onto the bridge. It was silent, save for the hum of the active magic, and impossibly high. Ethan, terrified of heights but focused entirely on Serafina, moved quickly, placing himself between her and the direction of the citadel. They were halfway across the void when a high, distant sound cut through the magic-induced silence, the rhythmic, furious thrumming of a sanguine patrol skiff. Lyra had anticipated the rout. Airborne scouts. They've spotted the bridge, Serafina shouted. They won't risk crossing the magic, but they'll try to collapse it from the side. Ethan looked back. The skiff was a sleek, black craft powered by sanguine fire, rapidly approaching the gorge from the citadel's direction. It was too fast and the bridge offered no cover. We need speed, Ethan urged. I can't fly in this state, and the sigil won't allow me to channel enough explosive power to destroy the skiff, Serafina replied, pushing him forward. As the skiff approached, a volley of crystallized bolts, infused with Lyra's crimson fire, were shot at the obsidian bridge. The bolts struck the magical anchor points, and the bridge shuddered violently. Shards of obsidian cracked and fell into the abyss. Serafina knew one focused hit would destroy the anchor. She had to disable the skiff without triggering a massive energy discharge that could destabilize the whole bridge and send them both plummeting. She stopped, turning to face the approaching craft. She aimed her hands at the skiff, channeling the frost, not as a projectile but as a silent, binding curse, a massive wave of absolute zero. She focused on the delicate sanguine fire engine. The wave of intense cold traveled across the void. It didn't explode the skiff, but the instant drastic drop in temperature shocked the fire core. The sanguine fire, Lyra's signature power, was designed to hate the cold. The engine sputtered, then choked violently, freezing solid. The skiff plunged abruptly into a deadly, chaotic spin, slamming uncontrollably into the far side of the gorge cliff face, nowhere near the bridge. The threat was eliminated, but the sheer effort of pushing that much non-explosive cold power across the massive distance was crippling. Serafina staggered, grabbing the railing of the bridge, her vision blurring. She had pushed her magical limits. "Sarah, you did it?" Ethan rushed back to her, supporting her weight. "No time, Ethan." Serafina pointed back towards the citadel. A second, much faster vessel was approaching, not a scout skiff but a single, sleek black flyer. It was faster than anything the General Guard possessed, and the figure standing at its helm was undeniable. Lyra herself, her armor shimmering under the moonlight. The Queen was taking the pursuit personally. Lyra stopped her flyer far back from the gorge's edge, unwilling to risk her life or machine against the volatile magic. She landed on the cliff face and stepped onto the activation stone that still bore Serafina's blood. Lyra raised her hand, and the air around her turned deep crimson. She did not aim for the bridge. She aimed for the neutral zone on the far side. She unleashed a massive focused beam of pure sanguine fire, a weaponized curse of political consequence. The blast didn't hit the land. It scorched a massive, smoking black line on the ground just inside the neutral zone's border, burning the ancient magical wards of the non-aggression pact. Her voice, amplified by her power, roared across the chasm, piercing the silence of the night. "The pact is broken, Serafina. You crossed the line, I burn the neutral zone. I will bring every single rogue house and every mortal settlement into this war. Now choose. Abandon the human and return to the citadel, or be responsible for the death of thousands." Serafina and Ethan were mere feet from safety, but the path was now sealed with a devastating moral choice. They could step onto the scorched earth of the neutral zone, but doing so would trigger the civil war and the genocide Lyra threatened. Ethan looked at the scorch mark, then back at Serafina, his eyes filled with agonizing realization. She didn't destroy the bridge, she destroyed the sanctuary. She's forcing us to turn back. Serafina straightened, ignoring the protests of her body, the pain of her healing wound, and the exhaustion. She looked across the abyss at the terrifying figure of her mother, Lyra, standing on the activation stone, radiating absolute, merciless power. "No," Serafina said, her voice quiet but ringing with finality. "She thinks she has me trapped between obedience and murder. But I am not an obedient daughter, and I am not a murderer. There is a third option, Ethan. We don't return and we don't step onto the neutral zone." She turned, looking down the dark gorge. "We are going down. We have to leave the ground, leave the air. Lyra controls the surface. But below the surface even she has limits." She looked at Ethan, her crimson eyes blazing with a new, dangerous resolve. "She showed us the ventilation shaft. There must be an entire underground network we don't know about. We must find the ancient, submerged caverns. It is the only place she cannot easily follow. Sarah, that's suicide. The gorge is bottomless. We'd be crushed by the fall or the water pressure," Ethan argued desperately. Serafina smiled, a cold, frightening expression. "The winter moon controls the cold, and the cold controls the water. I will create a path. We descend. We will use the deep earth as our fortress." She moved to the edge of the bridge and before Ethan could stop her, she plunged over the side into the dark, churning mists of the Sentinel Gorge. The plunge into the Sentinel Gorge was immediate, absolute terror. The air rushed past Serafina and Ethan with the force of a physical blow, and the world became a dizzying blur of dark rock and swirling, freezing mist. Ethan screamed, clutching desperately at Serafina's cloak, his body tumbling uncontrollably. Serafina, despite the terror and the massive drop, maintained an icy calm. She refused to lose focus, knowing that 1 second of panic would see them both crushed against the canyon floor. She channeled the winter moon power outwards, not as a projectile but as an expansive, decelerating force field. A cloud of shimmering, crystalline frost erupted from her armor, enveloping them both. It was an exercise in pure magical will, using absolute zero to manipulate the density of the surrounding air and mist, turning the very atmosphere into a cushion. Their freefall immediately slowed to a manageable, gliding descent. The frost shield surrounding them pushed away the wind and the freezing moisture, creating a temporary, stable bubble of still air. The sheer effort was agonizing, pulling violently against the calming influence of the deceleration sigil, but Serafina gritted her teeth and held the field steady. Sarah. I can't see anything. Ethan yelled, his voice muffled by the shield. Keep your eyes closed. Focus on my voice. The mist is thick but the shield is holding. This is the air of the winter moon. It will protect us. Seraphina's voice was strained, the power demanding intense, surgical control to maintain the delicate balance between descent and crushing force. High above, standing on the edge of the collapsing ancient trade bridge, Queen Lyra watched the impossible happen. Her air was not plunging to her death, she was floating. The thick, swirling mist that usually defined the gorge was turning pale blue and strangely rigid around her. Lord Forelag scrambled to catch up, his breath ragged. Majesty. She's neutralizing the fall. The power, it's not localized. She is controlling the atmospheric pressure. Lyra's face was a mask of cold fury and dawning realization. This is no mere shield, Forelag. This is the ultimate defensive magic. It is antithetical to the sanguine fire. We burn, she freezes. We are aggression, she is negation. She is a systemic threat to everything we are. Lyra immediately abandoned the political leverage. The threat to the neutral zone was meaningless if Seraphina escaped with that power. Send the Order of the Black Blood to the lower cliff face. They are to prepare for ground engagement. Lyra commanded, her voice ringing with the finality of war. If she survives the descent, they are to capture her and execute the human immediately. And prepare my skiff. I will follow them. If they reach the caverns they will be unreachable. Forelag hesitated. The lower gorge is too unstable for the sanguine fire, Majesty. The rock is porous. The pressure is volatile. Then we force the issue. If the ice is her shield, fire is our hammer. I want sanguine fire concentrated on the water level. We will boil her out or the pressure will crush her. Seraphina and Ethan continued their harrowing descent, the distance seeming endless. The mist gradually thinned as they approached the base, replaced by the profound roar of a massive, subterranean river. The shield hit the surface of the freezing water with a shock that jarred every bone in Seraphina's body. The shield, designed to manipulate gaseous atmosphere, was now struggling against liquid pressure. Water rushed in, soaking their clothes and chilling Ethan instantly. We need to go deeper. Seraphina gasped, the strain making her body tremble violently. The submerged caverns are hidden beneath the pressure line. The water was turbulent, black, and impossibly cold, its force threatening to tear Ethan from her grasp. Seraphina realized she could not merely push the water away, she had to command it. She pushed the frost power to its absolute limit, channeling it into the churning liquid around them. The water did not instantly freeze into a solid block, which would have killed them both, but it became dense, viscous, and strangely quiet. Seraphina shaped the thick, heavy medium around them, forming a perfect crystalline ice bubble, a pressurized submersible shell made of slow-moving, intensely cold water. Inside the bubble, the pressure was bearable but the darkness was absolute. They were suspended in the silent, churning void, descending rapidly into the abyss. Ethan, his mortal senses useless, clung to her. Sarah. I can't breathe. It's too deep. The sigil is working. Seraphina grunted, focusing on the psychic link, her mind filtering his mortal panic. We are protected. But the pressure is building. I need to find the entrance quickly. She directed the bubble downwards, relying on the ancient knowledge in the whisperer texts that described the entrances to the deep earth being subtly hidden by pre-sanguine rock formations. They sank deeper, the blackness so profound that it seemed to absorb all sound and light. Ethan's consciousness was fading rapidly under the stress and cold. Seraphina had to act on pure instinct. She pushed the frost power outside the bubble, feeling the texture of the rock walls surrounding the gorge floor. She felt the difference, the natural, chaotic roughness of the gorge bedrock, and then a smooth, ancient seam, a sign of intelligent shaping. There. Seraphina whispered, her voice amplified by the pressure. She propelled the bubble towards the seam. It was a vast, sealed archway hidden by centuries of silt and rock. Seraphina pressed the bubble against the seam, touching the rock with her hand. She concentrated all the freezing power she could muster, channeling the force into a single devastating point, the ancient seal holding the entrance shut. The rock groaned in protest. The seal, designed to withstand the heat and pressure of the magma core, was being assaulted by its opposite. With a silent, seismic crack, the seal shattered. The wall dissolved, revealing a narrow, sloping underwater tunnel, the entrance to the submerged caverns. The ice bubble rushed through the newly opened portal, propelling them into the tunnel. They shot out of the water into a vast, silent cave. The air was thick and moist, and the chamber was lit only by the faint, phosphorescent glow of crystals embedded in the ceiling. The floor was solid, dry rock, and a shallow stream of water rushed back into the tunnel they had just breached. Seraphina collapsed onto the stone, pulling Ethan out of the water, the ice bubble dissolving around them. He was unconscious, shivering violently, his mortal system shocked by the pressure and the cold, but he was alive. Serafina lay panting, utterly drained. The deceleration sigil had kept the baby safe, but she had pushed her magic beyond anything she had imagined. Suddenly, a profound booming sound echoed from above, vibrating through the rock. Lyra's attack. Looking up at the broken portal they had just used, Serafina saw a hideous sight. The water in the tunnel was violently churning, not with chaos but with steam. Lyra had unleashed her sanguine fire, heating the river water to boiling point, attempting to force them out or drown them in scalding water. The entrance they had just used was instantly sealed by the steam and pressure. They were cut off, their only path forward being the dark, unknown depths of the submerged caverns. But they were safe from the surface. Serafina dragged Ethan further into the darkness of the cavern, pulling him towards a narrow, shadowed passage. They had reached their fortress. Now she needed to heal and she needed to learn the secrets this deep earth might hold. Serafina dragged Ethan further into the massive, silent cavern, away from the steam-choked tunnel entrance. She laid him gently on a slab of smooth, cold rock, her own body protesting the severe drain of the past hours. The phosphorescent crystals in the ceiling cast a soft, ethereal light, illuminating a world of strange, cathedral-like formations and quiet, hidden pools of water. Ethan was still unconscious, his mortal heart racing unevenly. Serafina immediately reached for the satchel provided by Alara, retrieving a vial of concentrated blood essence. A potent, strengthening draught meant only for the deepest fatigue. She poured a small amount past Ethan's lips, then watched anxiously as his breathing slowly steadied, the intense shivering subsiding. She sat back, exhausted but steady, the deceleration sigil maintaining its cold, calm presence. The immediate threat was neutralized, but her energy was depleted, and Lyra was undoubtedly seeking a new point of entry. As Ethan slept, Serafina followed the strongest magnetic pull of the chamber. It led her to a massive, perfectly carved dais at the cavern center. This was no natural formation, it was a structure built by ancient hands. On the dais stood an altar made of pure, translucent ice, glowing with the same internal blue light that now radiated from her own power. She realized this was the sanctuary of the winter moon. She reached out and placed her hand on the cold altar. Instantly, a torrential wave of ancient knowledge flooded her mind, a vision clear and chilling of the Coven's history. The Winter Moon Coven were not recluses, they were the guardians of the borderlands. They had developed their power not to challenge the sanguine physically, but to ensure balance. They knew the sanguine fire, Lyra's power, was inherently destructive and driven by ego. Their ice magic, however, was designed to negate, defend, and preserve. Their ultimate aim was not to seize the throne, but to ensure that the aggressive, consuming nature of the sanguine did not destroy the mortal world, the very world Lyra was now threatening. The vision showed them accepting human hybrids, realizing the mixed blood produced stronger, more stable users of the frost magic. Serafina recoiled, understanding the profound truth. Her child was not an abomination, it was the key to balance. Her power was designed to protect the vulnerable, not to conquer the strong. She had been misusing it, treating it as a weapon of rage like her mother, instead of a shield of cold resolve. She looked back at Ethan, who was beginning to stir, and realized his fragility was not a weakness, but the very catalyst for the protective, selfless magic she needed to master. Meanwhile, on the cliff face high above, Lyra stood with foreleg, her armor stained with the heat of her own desperate magic. She had failed to boil them out, but she had located the cavern structure. The pressure is too great, Majesty. We cannot breach the main seal without collapsing the entire gorge. Foreleg cried, shielding his face from the intense, focused heat Lyra was channeling. Then we will not breach the main seal. We will burn the earth itself. Lyra snarled. She began to channel her sanguine fire, not into the water but into the deep, porous bedrock. It was a catastrophic use of power, risking the collapse of the mountain itself. She directed the heat to follow the natural seams, aiming for a weak point directly above the sanctuary. A low, resonant groan echoed from the earth. The bedrock cracked, steam and volcanic gases spewing forth as Lyra's heat magic tore through the stone. A new, violently unstable passage opened into the sanctuary cavern. Lyra, Foreleg, and 4 royal guards descended into the cavern on ropes, landing heavily on the stone floor. The air inside instantly grew hot and sulphurous, the natural cold of the sanctuary fighting against the sanguine heat. Lyra saw them immediately, Serafina standing tall beside the glowing ice altar and Ethan, awake, scrambling to his feet, trying to position himself between the queen and his wife. Serafina, you have defied the throne, you have murdered a hunter, and you have risked the collapse of our territory. Lyra's voice was terrible, amplified by the cramped space. Surrender the human and the sigil, now. This treason ends here. Serafina did not move. She felt the true nature of her power, calm, cold, and absolute, and it was utterly different from her mother's volatile rage. "I will not surrender the future, mother," Serafina stated, her voice steady and clear. "You fear what you cannot control, and that fear has made you tyrannical. You are destroying the very purity you seek to protect." Ethan stepped forward, placing his hand gently on Serafina's arm. "Your Majesty, we only wanted to live in peace. We broke the law, yes, but we never meant harm. Please accept the truth of our love and let the child live." Lyra laughed, a sharp, vicious sound. "Well, a mortal weakness. Guards, seize the human. We will execute him here, and shatter the princess's will through the loss of her precious anchor." The royal guards rushed forward, their axes drawn. Serafina acted not with a blast, but with a silent, profound act of creation and negation. She channeled the full, terrifying power of the winter moon into the ice altar beneath her palm. The altar flared, and a massive, dome-shaped wave of absolute zero erupted outwards. It was not a weapon, it was an instantaneous, impenetrable fortress of ice. The dome encased Serafina, Ethan, and the altar, perfectly sealing them within a flawless, towering structure of deep blue, shimmering ice. The royal guards hit the barrier and were thrown backward, their metal armor instantly coating in thick rime, stinging them with frostbite. They were not hurt, but they were stopped absolutely. Forelag, seeing the magic's true scale, immediately launched a potent binding spell, a crimson chain of sanguine energy designed to suppress all blood magic. The chain slammed into the ice dome, but the effect was astonishing. The intense cold neutralized the heat of the sanguine energy. The crimson chain simply froze upon impact, shattering into dust before it could touch Serafina. The negation. Forelag screamed, fear replacing arrogance. It is the perfect counter. Her defense negates all sanguine offense. Lyra, trapped outside the dome, slammed her fist repeatedly against the smooth, unbreakable surface, the crimson of her power bleeding uselessly onto the impervious blue ice. "Open this, Serafina. You are cornered. You will starve. You cannot win." Serafina looked out through the translucent ice at her mother, at the fury, the fear, and the absolute power that had suddenly been rendered obsolete. "I'm not cornered, mother. I am home," Serafina said, her voice echoing calmly within the dome. "You are trapped. You cannot breach the ice, and the path you burned into the bedrock is unstable. If you use your fire again, the entire sanctuary will collapse, and you will be buried beneath your own ruin." The ultimate confrontation was not a battle of strength, but a checkmate of magic. Lyra's aggressive power was useless against Serafina's defensive mastery. Serafina lowered her head, the blue light of the altar reflecting in her eyes. "I know the truth of the winter moon, Lyra. It exists to enforce balance. I give you a choice. Retreat and accept the existence of the human lineage and the hybrid child, or stay here and be defeated by the chaos of your own rage." Lyra stared at the ice, at the reflection of her own tyrannical face. The moment stretched, thick with the weight of centuries of tradition. Finally, Lyra lowered her hand, her shoulders slumping in defeat. She looked utterly diminished. "You have changed the rules, Serafina," Lyra said, her voice low and broken. "This throne cannot stand on ice. It requires fire. If this is the future, then the kingdom I built is obsolete." Lyra turned her back on the ice dome, acknowledging the finality of the defeat. She gave a single, curt order to the guards and Forelag: "Retreat. We leave this place. We leave them to their balance." Weeks later, Serafina was no longer in the cavern. The sanctuary had served its purpose. She and Ethan had returned to the surface but not to the citadel. They had sought refuge in the deep, unguarded wilderness of the neutral zone. Lyra had kept her word, retreating to the citadel, the threat of civil war holding her political rage in check. Serafina gave birth to their child in a hidden, sunlit meadow, far from the cold stones of the citadel. The birth was arduous, but safe, aided by Ethan's gentle, mortal hands and the stabilizing influence of the residual sigil magic. The child was a boy named Elias. He was neither entirely human nor entirely vampire. He possessed his mother's pale hair, but his eyes were a startling, vibrant azure, the color of the purest winter moon frost. He breathed like a mortal, but his skin held the coolness of ancient stone, and he radiated a peaceful, profound calm that seemed to quiet the nervous energies of the forest around them. The hybrid child, the heir of Lyra and the son of a cartographer, was the living embodiment of the balance Serafina had fought for. Serafina had not returned to claim the throne, but she had sent a single, clear message to the citadel. The kingdom of Viridia would no longer be ruled by fear and purity, but by balance and defense. Lyra remained queen, but her power was checked, forever held in place by the knowledge that the Winter Moon Coven, the coven of frost and preservation, had returned in the form of her own heir, and that her grandson, Elias, represented a future where human warmth and vampire strength could coexist. Serafina stood with Ethan, holding their child under the soft light of the twin moons, no longer an heir but a guardian. They had lost their titles and their home, but they had won their lives, their love, and the future of their hybrid son. The long night of sanguine tyranny was ending, replaced by the quiet, resolute power of the eternal, defensive frost.